followed, including the shooting of Judah Dewar, a man with no connection with gangs but was mistaken for an LSC member because he drove a BMW. A 15-year-old who went by the street name Little T was suspected of the murder. Little T was part of the Pitbull Crew, a new gang formed in memory of Ray Pitt by his younger brother Tommy. The gang was made up partly of ex-Doddington members who defected after the Civil War. Little T was cleared of murder and walked free. Indeed, only 8% of shootings in Manchester led to a conviction. The first week of 2000 saw 4 more unsolved gang murders, and as comparisons were once again being drawn to New York, Mike Tyson, in Manchester to fight Julius Francis, made a speech urging the gangs to make peace. But within days, several members of Gooch, LSC and Doddington were shot. The war was now so fierce that a truce was truly impossible. By 2000, there were 4 warring gangs in South Manchester, the Doddington and the LSC versus the Gooch and the Pitbulls or PBC. The PBC was the newest, youngest and smallest gang, but under Tommy Pitt, by now Manchester's most feared man, they became ruthless. Tommy was jailed around the time his brother was killed in the Civil War, and he came out with a deep hatred for the Doddington and the LSC. In March, the bodies started to pile up again, and 13 members of PBC and LSC were shot in 3 weeks. Then the bodies of 2 Doddington members were found in Leeds. Several Gooch members were questioned, but after 2 trials, no one was convicted, despite one member giving a confession in an interview. In the summer of 2000, Tommy ran his pitbulls like an army and ordered many executions, especially from his younger, Little T, a 15-year-old pup weaned by a cruel master. One evening, the PBC kidnapped an LSC boy and tortured him in a nearby park, laughing as the victim cried that he never meant to get caught up in the LSC, that he was in too deep and that he was sorry. Little T offered to kill him as a favour to Tommy, but Tommy decided to let him live if he won a game of Russian roulette. Tommy put a gun, loaded with 1 bullet, to the victim's head, and asked, "Is it your time?" before pulling the trigger. He repeated this 3 times, but the gun never fired. The Pitbulls then stoned him with bricks but left him alive as a warning to the LSC. One of those present was a PBC member called Slips, who knew the victim from childhood. Slips was high up in the crew, but the gang life was wearing on him. After his family was targeted by the LSC, his parents' car sprayed with gunfire. One day, Tommy was at the wheel with Slips next to him when they found some Longsight guys in a car. Tommy ordered Slips to shoot them with a MAC-10 as he drove past. As they drew parallel, Slips was poised to pull the trigger, but when he got a good look at the frightened LSC boys inside, he noticed one of them was his cousin and held back, allowing them to escape. Slips claimed he couldn't pull the trigger because his hand was injured. It was a plausible story, as weeks before he had been run over in an attack, but Tommy wasn't convinced and drove home silently as Slips repeated the excuse. Tommy punished members who failed his missions harshly. Little T got the worst of it, but that day Slips got off easy. Probably because later on Tommy was in a good mood after he raided LSC's estate. He caught 2 rivals, but his MAC-10 jammed and they escaped. As he fixed his weapon, he saw another LSC soldier, Marcus Greenidge. The 2 who escaped tried to call Greenidge to warn him, but didn't get through, and Greenidge was shot in the head before he could pull out his gun. Tommy went into Slips's house smiling and bragging that he whacked a Longsight boy. Little T looked up to Tommy and praised him for taking out the enemy. Tommy then ordered Little T to get rid of the weapons, but Little T forgot, and the same evening he was raided by police who had been watching his apartment. Little T escaped out the back, but police found drugs and weapons with Tommy's DNA. Tommy was furious and beat up the teenager viciously. 3 days later, Tommy ordered Little T to meet him. Little T arrived at the location wearing the gang's uniform with a copy of the search warrant in his hand. Later that day, his body was found at the location with a bullet in his head. Everyone, including the police, suspected this was LSC's revenge for Greenidge, and less than a week later, the LSC shot Tommy with a MAC-10, but he managed to survive. While in the hospital, even the armed police say they were scared by Tommy's switching moods, and when he was discharged from the hospital, he was immediately arrested for killing Greenidge. Shortly after, Slips was also arrested and questioned. Tommy ordered him to blame all PBC crimes on a man called Zika, an ex-member who was marked for death by Tommy. Slips began following the orders, but midway through his statement he had an epiphany. He thought about Little T. Slips was now certain that Tommy killed his own younger, who was so loyal to him for failing too many times. He thought about the 15-year-old's face, bruised from Tommy's beating, and decided to become a government witness, bringing down the PBC. Tommy was convicted of killing Greenwich but cleared of killing Little T. At the same time Tommy Pitt was sentenced, Piggy and Cabbo, the leaders of younger Gooch, were jailed for 9 years for gun possession. The pair were suspects in several murder cases that didn't stick, including the killing of Roger Ormsby, a Gooch older who was trying to tame his out-of-control youngers, who told him what they thought of his advice in the bluntest of terms. His body was found in a burning car with a bullet in the head. The LSC leader was also sentenced for threatening a murder witness, but even with all these figures out of the picture, the war was far from over. In March 2001, 2 Pitbulls who were yet to be sentenced made sure the PBC went out with a bang, kidnapping 2 LSC members. One was executed with 4 bullets to the back of the head, and the other was taken to a train track, shot and lit on fire. Chad and Casper were convicted and given life sentences, finishing the PBC for good. That summer, Alan Byron was gunned down by a new Gooch-affiliated gang called the Rusholme Mandem, who formed the Rusholme Crips after a change of leadership. LSC then killed a Gooch man in a drive-by. Many tit-for-tat killings followed that summer, one of them being Dean Eccleston. Dean narrowly escaped execution by Little T and Slips the year before, but now he was killed for associating with LSC. Another LSC member, George Lynch, was caught and shot dead in front of his family. The LSC hit back, shooting multiple Gooch and Rusholme members. On one occasion, Richard Solomon, LSC's second in command, shot dead Stephen Amos, who was the younger brother of Cabbo. Stephen played for Man City in his youth and was good friends with Wes Brown, and his shooting showed that the LSC was really on the rampage. Stephen's murder became a problem for LSC in the long term though, because his murder coincided with the rise of another gang, the Longsight Street Soldiers, or LSSS, based in Bellevue. LSSS allied themselves with the Gooch because of Stephen's death, and opened fire on an LSC party shortly after, hitting a 16-year-old in the chest. Gooch, Rusholme and LSSS stepped up their attacks on Doddington, in particular on a man called Gav, who was the son of the gang's founder and by now Manchester's most feared gangster. Gav was ambushed many times, including one time where he was shot in the head but survived. But even though they couldn't kill Gav, in April an LSC younger was shot 4 times in the back, piercing his heart. By 2003, most of the members involved were too young to know how the war started. The drug rivalry was no longer relevant as the drug markets moved out of Manchester to country lines. But now a tribal gang culture had embedded itself in South Manchester, and all the new generation knew was that they were supposed to hate the other side. This gang war had already claimed 26 lives since the start of the millennium, even though South Manchester is so small that many enemies knew each other. Little EJ was one of those born into the gang life. His older, who was called EJ, was serving life for murdering a man who told him to stop fighting. And his brother was jailed for threatening police with a machine gun. Little EJ, like his rival Gav, had a charming nature but made a dangerous enemy, and he flew into a murderous rage when he saw Doddington member Ramon killing him in cold blood. New gangs emerged across South Manchester. The Old Trafford Crips, Whalley Range Crips and the Fallowfield Mandem or FMD all allied themselves with the Gooch, whereas the Moss Side Bloods and Haydock Close Crew allied themselves with Doddington. The Old Trafford Crips in particular revived the dying tradition of wearing gang colours, and Manchester saw another unfortunate spate of murders as these new sets inherited the feud. In 2006, another murder horrified even the trauma-weary residents of the Alexandra Park estate. A 15-year-old boy was riding home when a gunman lurking in the shadows followed him and shot him. According to his mother, he was killed for refusing to pick a side in the gang war. Unusually for a Manchester murder, this hit nationwide news, mirroring the response to Benji Stanley 13 years earlier. The suspect, a member of the Old Trafford Crips, was later shot by the Doddington but survived the first of 4 attempts on his life. The next day, the Doddington shot a 16-year-old girl while shouting, "If you aren't Gooch, then why are you running?" A US hip-hop group, Public Enemy, visited the location of the murder and told the youths of Manchester to stop gang warfare, but this was only followed by a new wave of killing. In 2007, Piggy and Cabbo were released on parole, and both were intent on avenging Cabbo's brother Stephen. After attending a funeral, Piggy was out looking for Longsight boys and spotted Risky.
On June the 15th, in the 5th drive-by shooting that week, Ukal Chin was shot dead in his car on Anson Road in Longsight. A silver Audi had pulled up alongside his red Renault Megane and shots were then fired at him. But the fatal violence didn't end there. At Ukal's funeral the following month, gunmen pulled up in 3 cars and sprayed bullets at the mourners. Among them were women and children who were gathered for the wake.
Tyson from LSC was fatally injured at the funeral, and Tyson was the younger brother of Marcus. Several Gooch and LSSS members were convicted of these shootings, and at the same time, a massive swoop took down every active gang member in the city, including most LSSS members whose gang dissolved after they were all given lengthy sentences. For once, the police could claim victory. Throughout the spring and summer of 2007, they were responding to 7 shootings a day. But after this operation, gun crime in South Manchester fell by 92%. But this victory was short-lived, as gang culture reached the social media age. Grime music took a while to catch on in Manchester, but in 2008, grime diss tracks were released on MySpace by Manchester's younger Crip and Bloodsets. That January, Holton McCollin was mistaken for a Haydock member and shot outside a takeaway.
An innocent young man described as a role model within his community, shot dead in what police say was a cold-blooded and brutal murder, and now it's believed the intended target may have been this man, who lived in Stretford and had at one time been on the books at Manchester United, though last year he was sentenced to 8 years in prison for possessing a firearm.
Days later, the LSC responded by shooting FMD members with a sawn-off shotgun, fatally hitting an FMD younger called LB. LB was just 16, and tensions in South Manchester were once again running high, as the relative peace following the swoop in 2007 ended. Youth workers found that kids as young as 12 were forced to pick sides for protection, as living in rival territory made you a target. The question, "Where are you from?" was a life or death matter, and gang membership paradoxically became both their protection and the biggest threat to their safety. So new gangs were formed, such as the West Gorton Crew and the Mount Road Crew. In Wythenshawe, the largest estate in Europe, a gang called the Bench Hill Mad Dogs made national headlines after a member was seen making a gun gesture behind then Tory leader David Cameron. There was also the Portuguese Mafia, made up of Portuguese immigrants based in Stockport, showing how far gang culture spread from its Moss Side origins. As Stockport is viewed as the posher borough of Manchester, but Stockport also has many tough estates such as Foden's hometown of Edgeley, and even though Stockport seems safe by Manchester standards, it still has a higher murder rate than all inner London boroughs except Lewisham. After LB died, violence rose to such an extent that the gang threat was defined as critical. One incident saw teenager G-Seps chased by FMD youngers on bikes. G-Seps ran through traffic and even tried to carjack a woman to escape his attackers. He was running out of breath when police saw him and saved his life by arresting him before the FMD caught up. G-Seps was known to both sides of Manchester's gang war. At 13, he was shot by a gunman who opened fire on a group of teenagers. The gunman also hit a kid called Shaq, holding him down and pumping several shots into his chest. Despite this shared trauma, Shaq and G-Seps became enemies. In fact, Shaq, whose Gooch uncle was murdered by Doddington, was one of those chasing G-Seps in 2008. Shaq and the other FMD members were brought before a judge, who ruled that they would be jailed if caught wearing gang colours or entering rival territory again. Unfortunately, this ruling made no difference to the life of G-Seps. By the time the FMD members were sentenced, he was already dead. In May 2009, he was in a car with Trav, the chief suspect in the LB murder. Hillbob, JB and Mojo crept up and fired into the car. They missed Trav but hit G-Seps in the head. JB and Hillbob were caught and sentenced for their role, but Mojo was nowhere to be seen.
Wanted posters don't come much bigger than this. The face being beamed across Piccadilly Gardens and outside Piccadilly Station is that of 16-year-old Moses Matthias. Police have been looking for him for 4 months now. They believe he may have been involved in the killing of Giuseppe Gregory, who died in May after being shot in the head in Stretford.
After 2 years on the run, Mojo was caught hiding in the Netherlands. Mojo was known to hate the Bloods of Manchester after he was shot at 14 in a drive-by. In 2011, he was sentenced to 22 years. In recent years, many more young people have been killed. Despite guns being illegal in England, in 2021 you were more likely to be murdered in Moss Side than you were in Compton, the notorious LA neighbourhood from which Manchester gets its Crips vs Bloods inspiration. Making matters worse is the corruption in Greater Manchester Police.
Perhaps a little unfortunate to pick on GMP, but there is significant intelligence of police corruption there that, to my mind, has never actually been dealt with.
In 2020, GMP was placed under special measures by the government to control Manchester's violent crime problem. Their hardest task will be rooting out a deeply ingrained gang culture. One day, an anti-gangs activist working in primary schools asked a class of children to list the reasons people join gangs, and they had no problem filling the chart, she said. Then I asked them how they could get money without turning to crime, and they struggled. That is scary. And these kids weren't even bad kids. That is how deeply the gang lifestyle is ingrained.